Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, Soul Talk and Psychic Advice. Today, I want to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about. I follow this one influencer who's a therapist. His name is Therapy Jeff. And I remember a lot of people in threads didn't like him, and he made a mistake. He apologized. They're like, "Oh no, that's Darvo," and Darvo has a whole meeting. He's not sincere, and this is what other therapists were saying about him. And I said, "How do they know he's not sincere?" And I thought, why don't they like him? And I realized it's because sometimes he goes against the grain. And today I want to talk about what that is. I want to talk about this in general. Let's talk about some buzzwords that we've heard lately. Trauma. Okay, we're using that a lot now. Now everything's trauma. We've kind of lost the definition of that. And narcissism, we definitely have lost the definition of narcissism. Now everybody thinks their ex is a narcissist. Or this person wasn't nice to me, they're a narcissist, and my parents a narcissist. And narcissism has a distinct diagnosis. Only like maybe 5% maximum people in society out of 8 billion people are narcissists. So why is everybody calling their partner a narcissist? Gaslighting, we have milked that. Triggers, boundaries. I use that a lot too because that's a spiritual term and a psychology term. Toxic relationships. Everything's a toxic relationship. Attachment styles that came on the scene within this year like strong. Now everybody's like, well, this is my attachment style. And I've done some podcasts on attachment style because people are talking about it. People pleasing. It's always been a problem. I've always talked about it, but now it's becoming bigger, like more people talking about it. Emotional regulation, yeah, a lot of that too. The nervous system, I use those. These words are everywhere. You hear them on TikTok, you hear them on Instagram, you hear them in podcasts, including mine. You hear people using them when they're talking about their marriages, their childhood, their bosses, their parents, their exes, their friendships, about everything. Everybody's talking about it with labels, their situations. And some of this is good because we're becoming more open. I've watched the evolution. I'm 55, so I watched the evolution from 1985, 86 when Oprah came on the scene and started the conversations and other talk shows. But now we've gotten even more comfortable where people are like, well, my therapist said, before people didn't want to admit that they're going to a therapist. And I think that we've made enormous progress by giving people language for experiences they previously couldn't explain. But I've also started wondering something because I had to tell several people, no, your partner's not a narcissist. Read out the definition. Oh, no, they're mean to me. That isn't what a narcissist is. That may be a component of narcissism, but that isn't all that a narcissist is. They cheated on you. You can be a cheater without being a narcissist. You can be hey, that can make you an asshole or whatever, but it doesn't mean you're a narcissist. So, what happens when psychological language becomes popular culture? And this is done on purpose. And that's something that Therapy Jeff said. And I realized, ooh, this is done in the spiritual community too, on purpose. It's to make our work easier, it's to bring in clients, bring in business, kind of prime you for what's coming. And it's so, like, I didn't realize that there was somebody really feeding these words in our community. I just thought somebody went to a therapist or a spiritual coach and their influencer and they started talking about this stuff and it became big. I didn't know where it was coming from. But even more importantly, what happens when a clinical concept becomes a buzzword? And that's what these words, narcissism, gaslighting, trauma, triggers, boundaries, are all becoming buzzwords and losing their meaning, their purpose. They're being overused. I was listening recently, as I was saying to Therapy Jeff, a therapist and popular content creator, and he made a provocative comment about the way psychological terminology gets filtered down to the public. And social media makes it easier to do this now. It got me thinking about something much bigger. Where do these words come from? How how certain are these? How do certain psychological concepts suddenly seem to be everywhere? And what happens to the original meaning of a psychological concept after millions of people start using it on social media? It gets watered down because something interesting happens. A word can begin as a useful way of understanding human behavior and eventually become a label we attach to almost everything. And I think we need to talk about that because I think we're all kind of guilty of that because we don't know any better, right? We hear these words and they start resonating. Not because I want us to stop talking about trauma. No, that's my work. Not because narcissistic abuse isn't real. Not because gaslighting doesn't happen. It sure in the heck does. And now triangulation is coming onto the scene. And that's a big word. And that is something that narcissists do, but not only narcissists triangulate. And certainly not because boundaries aren't important. That's part of my work. They are. But because language sharpens perception, right? Once we learn a psychological word, we start looking for it. And sometimes we find something that desperately needed to be named. But sometimes we start fitting ordinary behavior into that label. And that's where things get interesting. And that's what has been happening. Not everybody is a fucking narcissist. Not everybody is gaslighting and triangulating, and not everything is trauma. Trauma means something that is too fast, too soon for your nervous system. Go through some of my podcasts, listen to other podcasts of people that you trust, and get the real meaning behind these words. So, the good thing that happened. Let's start with what I think we've gotten right. For generations, people went through incredibly painful experiences without having language for them. They just buried them and had to move forward. Someone might have grown up in a chaotic household and simply thought, that's just how families are. Yeah. Someone might have been manipulated by a partner and thought, maybe I really am crazy. Someone might have spent her entire life taking care of somebody else and thought, that's what a good woman does. Someone might have experienced a racing heart, hypervigilance, shutdown, panic, and thought, something is wrong with me. Then psychological language became more accessible, thank goodness, and suddenly people had words, trauma, fond responses coming onto the scene, emotional abuse, gaslighting, codependency, attachment, dissociation, nervous system dysregulation, people pleasing. Because I have to admit, years ago when I tried to talk about this stuff, people didn't have interest. And so these buzzwords, them getting filtered, has made my job easier. So I have to admit that. That language can be incredibly liberating, all these terms, right? Because sometimes naming something changes everything. You realize there's a reason I respond this way. There's a pattern here. Other people experience this too, especially when you don't feel alone anymore, you don't feel crazy or condemned. And this is all powerful. Maybe I can work with this, right? So this episode is not an argument against psychological education. No, because I have a biology degree I took a lot of psychology courses, so pretty much a minor. Although I didn't label it a minor when I applied for my degree, but I took a lot of psychology courses, I still do. It's an invitation to become more discerning about it. Because there's another side to this. When clinical language becomes internet language, once a psychological concept moves into popular culture, something often happens to it. It gets simplified, and then simplified again, and then simplified again, until eventually a complicated clinical ideal becomes a 30-second reel. 5 signs you're dating a narcissist, right? And everybody's looking like, oh my God, that's what's wrong with him. My ex is a narcissist. Oh, yeah, she's a narcissist. And so are my parents, right? And now we have a problem because human beings aren't five signs. No, we're gray, we're multi-layered. Relationships aren't five signs. Trauma isn't five signs. A nervous system isn't five signs. But social media loves certainty. And I think this is why sometimes I fail a little bit at social media because I don't like doing the 5 reasons you should do this and 6 reasons you should do that. And so social media loves certainty. It loves 3 signs, 5 red flags. If they do this, run. This means you're traumatized. This means you're dating a narcissist. This means your mother was emotionally immature. Moms are taking a beating these days, and some moms are very bad. I've seen some sad stories. But now everybody's like, I have a bad mother. This means you have an avoidant attachment style. Those statements get attention because certainty feels good, especially when we're hurting. If you've just gone through a painful breakup and someone says, here are 7 signs your ex was a narcissist, there can be something incredibly relieving about that. Because now there's an explanation. But explanations and diagnoses are not the same thing. And this is where we have to be careful. Let's talk about the word narcissist, which I am so over. You know, think about how often you hear the word narcissist now. Someone cheats, narcissist. Someone is selfish, narcissist. Someone doesn't apologize, narcissist. Someone doesn't validate you, narcissist. Someone talks about themselves too much, narcissist. Someone doesn't give you the relationship you want, narcissist. But narcissistic traits exist on a spectrum. Human beings can be selfish, defensive, emotionally immature, controlling, self-absorbed, inconsiderate, manipulative, and insensitive. And none of those behaviors are behaviors we need to tolerate, but they don't automatically mean we know someone's clinical diagnosis. And here's why I think this matters. Sometimes the label actually distracts us from the most important question. Instead of asking, is this person a narcissist? What if we ask, how do I feel when I'm consistently around this person? Yes. Do I feel safe? Do I feel respected? Can I express disagreement? Can I say no? Can we repair conflict? Does this person take responsibility? Do my boundaries matter? Am I constantly abandoning myself to maintain this relationship? Notice what just happened. We moved away from diagnosing them and came back to experiencing ourselves. That is embodiment, which has become another buzzword, but I've been studying these things for quite some time, but it's now being fed out through social media. And that's an incredibly important distinction. You don't necessarily need a diagnosis for another person to decide that a relationship isn't healthy for you. We love to label stuff. But we wouldn't want to be labeled, but we're labeling everybody else. What if somebody called us a narcissist because we told them no? And that's happened to me. I told someone no, and I said, okay, so I want you to look at the term narcissist and see if I qualify. And when I had my son, I had to take a lot of personality tests. They made me take that, I think is Minnesota something exam, some other ones, and I came out with none of those things. And, but if you tell someone no, they probably hate you and call you a narcissist and selfish and everything else. So, what happened to the word trauma? Yes, and I'm glad people are talking about it. So, my work doesn't sound so weird because I'm not working as a therapist, I'm working as a spiritual coach, and also as a grief coach. So, I'm glad the word is out there, but yeah, we're using this a lot too. Trauma may be one of the most important psychological concepts to enter mainstream culture. For years, trauma was dramatically underestimated. People were expected to simply get over things. Trauma, yeah, overused word. Childhood experiences were minimized, right? Emotional abuse was minimized. Grief was rushed. People were told to stop living in the past. The increased understanding of trauma has changed lives, yes, but the popular internalization of trauma has become another question. Have we sometimes expanded the word so far that almost every uncomfortable experience becomes trauma? There's an important difference between this was painful, this embarrassed me, this disappointed me, this overwhelmed me, this scared me, this was traumatic, and I developed an enduring trauma response. Those experiences can overlap, but they aren't automatically identical. And I think this distinction matters because discomfort is also part of being a human being. Rejection hurts, breakup hurts, failure hurts, right? Being misunderstood hurts, being criticized hurts, being told no hurts. Sometimes disagreeing with us can feel uncomfortable. Sometimes telling us no can feel uncomfortable. But healing cannot mean eliminating discomfort from our lives because we're going to go through some stuff. In fact, part of nervous system healing is often developing a greater capacity to remain present with discomfort without immediately interpreting it as danger. We're not trying to create a life where nothing activates us. That's not possible. Look at the world. We're developing the capacity to remain connected to ourselves when activation happens. Because shit's going to happen. I'm triggered. Boy, I'm over this one too. Here's another one, triggered. That word has become almost synonymous with I don't like this. But those aren't necessarily the same thing. Sometimes something genuinely activates an old survival response. Your body reacts before your logical mind even understands what's happening. Your chest tightens, your stomach drops, your breathing changes. You freeze. You want to escape. You want to fight. You want to appease. That's important information. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. A trigger doesn't necessarily tell us this person is dangerous. Sometimes a trigger tells us my body remembers something. Those are very different statements. Your nervous system can react to something happening now because it resembles something that happened before. Instead of immediately deciding, I'm triggered, therefore you did something wrong, I can become curious. What am I experiencing? Where do I feel it? What does this remind me of? What does my body believe is about to happen? What do I need right now? Is there an actual boundary violation happening? Or has something old been activated? Sometimes the answer will absolutely be yes, something is unsafe and is happening and I need to leave. Other times the answer might be I'm safe, but my nervous system hasn't figured that out yet. That discomfort is part of healing. And if you're in a relationship, you're going to get triggered. You are. If you have friends, if you have any type of relationships, you will be triggered by something from the past because we think we moved on and buried everything just fine, but those triggers are going to come to the surface if the healing work isn't done. Ooh, so let's talk about boundaries, another word we've changed. Yes, let's talk about boundaries. I love boundaries. You know I do. Boundaries are essential. I had to learn them. But we also started using the word boundary to describe things that aren't actually boundaries. A boundary isn't you aren't allowed to do that. A boundary is closer to if this happens, here's what I will do to take care of myself. That's the difference. Our boundaries is for us. It's not to tell other people how to behave. It's how we are going to behave. There's a difference between controlling another person and deciding what you will participate in. For example, you cannot raise your voice at me may be an understandable request, but if yelling starts, I'm going to end the conversation and we could try again when we're calmer. That's a boundary. You hear the difference? I can't stop you from yelling. I can't say, my boundary is you can't yell. I can't control you, but I can say, look, if you yell, I'm going to walk away. See the difference? That's the boundary. You know, it is something that I can actually control to say that if the yelling starts, I'm going to end the conversation. We could try again when we're calmer, or just say, I'm going to walk away. And that's embodied boundary work. Wow, two buzzwords in one sentence. Because a boundary isn't simply something we announce. A boundary is something we're willing to embody. And that's harder. Posting about boundaries is easy. Living them is uncomfortable because living a boundary may mean disappointing someone. It may mean someone doesn't like you. It may mean tolerating guilt. It may mean letting someone misunderstand you. That's the part of boundaries that doesn't fit quite as neatly into a 30-second reel. Oh, and I know I do the reels and I hate them too sometimes. I feel disconnected sometimes on social media because I want to talk to people, not at people, not down to people. I want to talk to people. I want us to have conversations. I want people to ask me questions. I don't want to just post reels, but I got to post them to say I'm here, but I miss the connection that we used to have. But there's so much social media. I think people don't have time to connect the way they used to. Now, spirituality has buzzwords too. Let's talk about them. And I want to be fair here because this isn't just happening in psychology. We do this in spirituality too, and I'm using words from both. Spiritual communities have their own language. Shadow work. Yeah, you're seeing that a lot now. Soulmates, twin flames, empaths. Boy, is that being overused. Even psychologists are starting to use that one. Energy vampires, manifestation, spiritual awakening, divine feminine, divine masculine, high vibration, low vibration, soul contracts, karmic relationships. And just like psychological terminology, some of these concepts can give people a framework for understanding their experiences. I use spiritual language myself, but spiritual language also requires discernment. Take shadow work. Shadow work can become a powerful invitation to explore the parts of ourselves we've rejected, hidden, or haven't wanted to acknowledge. But now almost any uncomfortable self-reflection can be called shadow work or considered soulmates. This ideal can be beautiful, right? But what happens when believing someone is your soulmate becomes a reason to stay in a relationship that repeatedly hurts you? And people do this. I know we're soulmates. How do you know? Soulmates, yeah, you're going to be triggered some, but you shouldn't be abused. That's not a soulmate. And people don't want to hear that. They're because we're so determined to find our soulmate and twin flame and everything's going to be perfect and beautiful and last forever. And that, you got to know what a soulmate is. And I've done a podcast on that. Look through my podcast topics. And then there's the term twin flame. This is where spiritual language can become particularly complicated because someone might experience an incredibly intense relationship. There may be attraction, separation, longing, reconnection, obsession, emotional highs and lows, and then they encounter the concept of twin flames. Suddenly, the intensity has an explanation. Where are twin flames? But here's the question I would ask. Does calling this person my twin flame help me see the relationship more clearly, or does it make me overlook what is actually happening? Because people go, well, twin flames, you don't really make it, but if you do, it could be beautiful. We got to stop with all of this. Sometimes we're just too far into the esoteric, and just take it by what's going on in the present moment. Because intensity isn't necessarily intimacy. Longing isn't necessarily compatibility. Chemistry isn't necessarily safety. And suffering isn't necessarily evidence that a relationship is spiritually desired. No, you're not supposed to be suffering, whether it's a twin flame, soulmate, karmic, no. That's where spiritual discernment becomes just as important as psychological discernment. The same applies to the term empath. My God, everybody thinks they're an empath. And there are a lot of empaths out there, but is all 8 billion people an empath? No. Recognizing that you're deeply sensitive to other people's emotions can be validating. But if I'm an empath becomes I have no control over what I absorb from other people, then a useful concept can accidentally reduce our agency. The goal shouldn't be to become less sensitive. The goal can be learning. How do I stay connected to myself while I'm feeling what's happening around me? And think about manifestation. Manifestation is a long-term buzzword, can encourage intention, possibility, and a different relationship with what we believe is possible. But manifestation can also become if something bad happened, your vibration attracted it. I hate that. That's where spiritual language can become harmful rather than empowering. We can honor spirituality without using spirituality to explain away every difficult human experience. Let's stop doing that, please. Sometimes a breakup is a breakup. Sometimes somebody isn't your twin flame. Sometimes someone is simply unavailable. Sometimes your energy vampire may be a person with whom you need better boundaries with. Sometimes you aren't low vibration. Sometimes you're grieving. Sometimes you're exhausted. Sometimes you're angry. Sometimes you're human. Yes. And I think spirituality becomes much more powerful when it allows room for our humanity rather than requiring us to spiritually explain everything. And that happens a lot in the spiritual community. When therapy speak becomes a way to avoid intimacy. Yes. Language that's supposed to help us connect can sometimes help us avoid connection. Imagine two people arguing. One person says, "You're gaslighting me." The other person says, "You're projecting." The first says, "You're a narcissist." The second one says, "You're emotionally dysregulated." Now everybody sounds like they've been in therapy for 15 years. And sometimes it's actually communicating. What would happen if we removed all the psychological language? This makes me laugh because people do this shit. Maybe underneath it is, when you said that, I felt dismissed. Yes, I'm scared you don't understand me. This is real language. I don't trust you right now. That's valid. I need you to listen. Yes, I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm afraid you're going to leave. That's being vulnerable. Calling someone a narcissist isn't necessarily vulnerable. Saying I'm terrified that I'm not important to you is. This is the language we need, not the therapy terms. Sometimes therapy speak gives us very sophisticated language for avoiding very simple feelings. And spiritual language can do the same thing. We're triggering each other's shadows. I'm sorry, but yes. I've heard this stuff, maybe. But because we also need to say, I'm hurt by what you did. Yes. That's why I didn't want to date a spiritual guy, because I didn't want to get caught up in this language. Social media rewards labels. We also have to understand the environment where we're getting this information. Social media isn't neutral. Algorithms reward attention, and nuance usually isn't as clickable as certainty. Yeah, nuances came onto the scene also. I remember when it first came on the scene. I gotta look this word up. Imagine these two video titles. Video number 1. Your partner sometimes behaving selfishly could have multiple explanations depending upon complex. Nobody's gonna click that. Now compare it with 7 signs you're dating a narcissist. Click. Or 5 signs you met your twin flame. Click. 3 signs you're going through a spiritual awakening. Click. The algorithm doesn't necessarily reward nuance. It rewards attention. And this is why I fell at social media a little bit. And that means complicated human experiences get reduced to labels. I don't want to label people, but it's like you got to do it to survive social media. Your algorithm can become an echo chamber. Let's say you watch 3 videos about narcissistic partners. The algorithm notices. Then it gives you more. You watch those. Now you're getting signs of covert narcissism. things narcissists say, why narcissists choose empaths, how narcissists manipulate you, how to recover from narcissistic abuse, or perhaps you watch twin flame content. Soon you're getting signs your twin flame is thinking about you. Why twin flames separate. Signs your twin flame is coming back. Why the runner leaves the chaser. And suddenly your entire feed is confirming one interpretation of your experience. That doesn't automatically mean the interpretation is wrong, but we need to understand what's happening. The algorithm isn't evaluating your relationship, it's evaluating your attention. It doesn't know your partner, it doesn't know your childhood, it doesn't know your spiritual path, it doesn't know the context. It knows you watch that video, give you another one. So we have to be careful about mistaking algorithmic repetition for confirmation, psychological confirmation, or spiritual confirmation. None of that can be confirmed through the algorithm. When a label becomes identity, and I know I'm going over my traditional 23, 25-minute podcast, but this is important. I hope people stay with me. Labels don't change how we see other people. They change how we see ourselves. We can go from I struggle with people pleasing to I'm a people pleaser, from I'm very sensitive to other people's emotions to I'm an empath and I absorb everyone's energy. You see the language? I struggle with people pleasing to I'm now a people pleaser. You see how it changes? From I sometimes feel anxious to I am an anxious person. From my nervous system learned to protect me this way to this is who I am. And I think that's where embodiment offers us something different. Instead of what's wrong with me, we ask what is happening inside me. We ask what is happening inside me is matters. That matters. Instead of what am I, we ask what pattern am I experiencing. This is what we want to do. We want to undo that algorithm crap. A pattern can change. An identity feels permanent. That's why we want to focus on the pattern versus identity. Don't throw out the language, not saying that. I don't want the pendulum to swing too far in the other direction. I'm not saying everybody talks about trauma now, so trauma isn't real. No. I'm not saying narcissistic abuse isn't real. It really is. I'm not saying boundaries aren't important. They are. And I'm not saying we have to throw away spirituality. No. Quite the opposite. The answer isn't stop using psychological or spiritual language. The answer is use the language with more discernment. Let the language open curiosity rather than close the case. There's a difference between I wonder whether this relationship contains some narcissistic dynamics and he's a narcissist, case closed. There's a difference between I feel profoundly connected to this person and they're my twin flame. Therefore, this relationship has to work. See the difference? Yes. This situation may be showing me I need to look at what's going on within myself. And this is my shadow. So I shouldn't hold the other person accountable. Nuance matters. Discernment matters. Come back to the body. And this brings me back to embodiment, which is becoming a buzzword. One of the things I want people to learn is how to come back to themselves. Not TikTok, not Instagram, not a quiz, not somebody else's diagnosis, not somebody else's spiritual interpretation. Yourself. When something happens before you immediately label it, see if you can pause. Notice your feet, notice your breath, notice your chest, notice your stomach, notice whether you're contracting, notice whether you're preparing to fight, flee, freeze, fight, or appease. And then ask, what am I actually experiencing right now? Not what psychological term describes this. Not what spiritual meaning can I assign to this, but what is happening inside of me? Because information is useful, but information isn't embodiment. Knowing the definition of a boundary isn't the same as setting one. Knowing what people pleasing is isn't the same as tolerating someone's disappointment. Knowing what shadow work is isn't the same as actually facing parts of ourselves we don't actually like. Knowing about nervous system regulation isn't the same as regulating ourselves during conflict. Eventually, healing has to move beyond vocabulary. It has to become a lived experience. 5 questions for the next buzzword. We're almost done here. So, the next time a psychological or spiritual term starts showing up everywhere, and it will, ask yourself, number one, what does this term actually mean? Number two, am I using this ideal to understand and experience or label a person? Number three, what context might I be missing? Because we're always missing context. Number four, does believing this increase my agency or decrease it? And this one may be the most important. Number five, does this belief help me see reality more clearly, or does it help me avoid a reality I don't want to accept? That can be a powerful question in psychology, and it could be a powerful question in spirituality. I'm going to close this long-winded thing out, but I think it's very important, this topic. You don't need a label to trust your experience. Here's what I ultimately want you to take away from this conversation. Language can be incredibly powerful. Psychological language, spiritual language. It can help us understand experiences that once felt confusing and isolating. But language should be a doorway. It shouldn't be a prison. You don't necessarily need to move that you don't need to prove that someone is a narcissist to decide you don't want to be in a relationship with them. It doesn't really close the door either. Some people will go back to a narcissist. You don't need to call every difficult experience trauma in order to acknowledge that it hurt. You don't need someone to be your soulmate or twin flame for a relationship to have been meaningful. Sometimes a relationship can be profound and still need to end. Sometimes something can hurt without it being trauma. Sometimes your nervous system can be activated without you being in danger. Sometimes you're not low vibration, you're having a hard day. Sometimes the deepest spiritual practice isn't finding a spiritual explanation. It's allowing yourself to experience the truth of what's actually happening. Maybe we need less labeling and more listening, less diagnosing and more discerning, less analyzing everyone around us and more noticing what happens inside us. Because ultimately, healing isn't about learning through psychological or spiritual vocabulary to explain every person you ever met. Let's stop labeling. We don't want to be labeled, but we're labeling other people. Healing is about becoming increasingly capable of staying connected to yourself, your body, your boundaries, your emotions, your intuition, your choices, your voice. So maybe the question isn't, where's the newest psychology or spiritual buzzword? Yeah, what's the newest psychology or spiritual buzzword? Yeah, you don't need that. Maybe the better question is, does this ideal help me understand myself more deeply? And does it help me to live differently? Because if all we're doing is collecting new words for old patterns, that's information. But when the awareness begins changing the way we show up in relationships, our work, and our lives, that's embodiment. And that's where the real work begins. I really wanted to talk about this because everything's out of control thanks to social media. And I know I have to go with the algorithm more if I'm going to ever grow more on social media and grow this podcast more, and I get there. But I want it to be authentic and stay with what's real. And I just will ask all of you, when you hear a term, don't just start assigning labels. Say, would I want to be called that? And kind of unravel things. Think clearly. You may have to listen to this podcast more than once. It was a lot of information. I probably did extra 15 minutes than what I usually do in a podcast. So I want to thank you for hanging on. Thank you for listening. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next episode.